Okay, my clock is showing 1:30, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to an in-training webinar from InAlliance. My name is Darius Brika. I'm a principal with the company. And for those of you that don't know much about InAlliance, we're a small but mighty consulting firm in Central Illinois, specializing in historic preservation and Main Street consulting services. And today's topic is one of my favorite subjects and pastimes, which is to take photographs of historic signs in our historic commercial districts. But before we delve into the subject, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping duties. First, because we're utilizing the GoToWebinar interface, you should have a sort of a dashboard on your screen which will allow you to select an audio option to participate in today's webinar. You can use either your mic and speakers of your computer, or alternatively you can dial in via a telephone. Furthermore, you will be able to ask me questions, and hopefully I will be able to answer them. There are two ways to do this. First, you can type them in anytime into the questions box, and I actually encourage you to do that and prefer that method. The other more traditional classroom method is to raise your hand, but in order to stay on schedule, on track, make sure we have enough time to cover everything, I would prefer if you just typed your questions in to the box, and we'll answer them at the end. Additional information: the webinar is being recorded, so as a follow-up, I will send you an email with a brief survey link and a link to the recorded webinar, so you can refer to it in the future or share it with others that you think may find it useful. And as part of the survey component, we would really appreciate it if you filled it out. It's very brief, but it will we appreciate any feedback so we can make these future webinars as useful as possible. So, without other distractions, let's delve into historic signs. Why should we care? Well, there are many reasons to care about historic signs, and I'll try to make the case in the next few slides here. Signage and type surround us, and they are part of our daily lives and a history of whichever city we happen to live in. So whether old or new, each sign has a story to tell, but historic signs in particular have very interesting and important stories to tell. First and foremost, they are very tangible pieces of graphic design and architecture. And a lot of people appreciate historic signs for those values and attributes. And in fact, because some signs can be small enough to and portable enough to be removed from buildings, signs become collector's items. And I'm actually guilty of that myself. I do have a couple of saved historic signs at home, but I would prefer if they remained on the buildings in the context for which they were designed and constructed. And that's because even more important for the graphic design and architectural value, historic signs offer a way to view the life of a business or the entity, the building that the sign is placed on, but as a collection they offer a way to view the life of a city, and they link and interweave stories of social change, politics, economics, factors that really aren't associated with graphic design and architecture, not necessarily, not traditionally, but historic signs offer us a way to bring all those stories together. So in this example of the Argenta Drug Company, we can track the evolution of this business simply by looking at the various levels of signs on this building, beginning in the late 19th century and ending sometime in the mid 20th century. We can see how this business remained profitable. We can begin to understand the various changes that were undergoing not just in Argenta but in our society through the drink Coca-Cola in bottles, advertisements, to all these various levels of signs on this particular building. There's so many different stories that can be told, again, just by looking through the signage. So historic signs offer us a linkage with the past, and they offer us a way of remembering and giving meaning to places, and furthermore, they're also an expression of ourselves. I would argue that that signage, even more so than architecture, we can relate to it more and to the instant heritage that it provides, and that's because signs are very direct, and they were intended to provide us with information, and because everybody can read signs, or at least I hope that they can, there is an immediate recognition and an understanding of what a sign is trying to do, versus architecture. Not everyone can quote-unquote read it, so there are a lot of meanings that architecture can be imbued with, but signage tends to be more direct, and we can identify it with it a lot easier. We as people have an essential need for this sense of real geographic location, which is counter to the placelessness of much modern media, particularly the internet. So as our daily lives are increasingly exposed to the anybody, anytime, anywhere of the internet, the importance of place to our sense of identity needs to be balanced by a more localized culture. And signage is a huge part of that environment. And so ultimately, if whatever we decide not to save, and if we don't save it, we will lose it. So just like with anything else, just like with historic preservation in general, we have to embrace our built environment, and our historic signs are part of it, figure out what is worth saving, and go from there. So for our discussion today, I wanted to develop a taxonomy of historic signs, and there are numerous ways of doing that. One, we could talk about signs by material. We could divide them up by design, by the age or era of their construction, perhaps by where they were placed on a facade, and all of these methods are valid. But in order to because we only have half an hour today, I chose to do it a different way, and I will present them to you by function. So we will talk about business identification, building identification, and there's a certain or lots of overlap between the first two categories. We'll talk about advertisements, mention directional and finding signage, and then finish with manufacturer's marks. So the quintessential function of a sign is to identify, and that was always the intention, and throughout history, signs play that role, and businesses and entities always wanted the best placement on the facade and the most prominent location in order to identify their presence on the street. And when I say business, I really mean organization or entity, which includes commercial and non-commercial purposes. So, but as in the example of Hoff's Bar and Lounge, the blank facade tries to utilize the square footage available by placing two signs, one projecting from the wall and the other sort of peeking above the parapet. It's a very, very creative form of signage, and very popular in the mid-20th century. there are certainly examples on Main Street of signs that are more integrated into the architecture, like the Crescent Jewelry sign, which is etched and painted structural glass panels above the transom level of this storefront. And then we have examples of signage at various places on a facade, including at our feet. Again, businesses were trying to either identify themselves on the street or constantly remind us of where we are. So even as you entered establishments, you were still given an opportunity to, or the businesses were given an opportunity to present further identification in front of you, as this terrazzo floor of the Chorba House of Beauty in Chicago demonstrates. But not all signs have to be large or necessarily even prominent. In the case of Masonic halls and lodges, secret societies in general, you could imagine that a giant sign wasn't desirable because it was sort of against the nature of these entities. So more elegant and understated solutions were sought, like these painted glass globes suspended from a wrought iron fixture in front of a building. So these were a little bit more clandestine, if you will, again, to coincide with the role of that particular organization. And to continue with this sort of inconspicuous placement of signage, these Montgomery Ward push plates on the entrance doors, again, remind us of what business we are entering by simply putting the very geometric emblem of the company, the M and the W, on the push plates. And signs don't even have to be typographic at all. Even in this case, when we dispense with lettering, we understand that this is a sign for an auto dealership. And we understand that now, and certainly in the 19-teens or 20s when this sign was installed, that would have been the case as well. So these are all just examples of the various methods of identification for a business on Main Street. Now, some signs bridge both business and building identification. So when we're talking about business identification, that typically is categorized as identifying a part of a building. So a sign can be confined to a storefront level, and therefore it identifies whatever entity occupies the storefront. But in certain instances, an entity occupies the entire building, and therefore the signage reflects that. So in the case of Jackson's Hardware, it is both a business identifier and a building identifier. Nobody would argue that this isn't the Jackson's Hardware building, because the sign is certainly large enough and critical enough to the architecture for that to be the case. More kind of traditional building identification and entity identification signs are post office, courthouse, library signs. They tend to be, again, very integral to the architecture and to our reading of the building. And then even more fantastic examples like this super graphic from the 1960s identifying this police station. So it would be very hard to reuse this facade for anything else other than a police station, and those are some challenges that we'll discuss in a minute. Some building identification can be without having anything to do with the business, and that typically occurs through on cornice pediments and parapets, where the original building owner is identified along with the construction date of the building. I count these as signs too because they provide information. So a lot of sheet metal cornices typically bear the name and the date of construction, like in this example. Other signs just have the owner's name, and others just have the date. but once again, I consider those signs for their information providing potential. And then cornerstones and various commemorative plaques, when they identify a place or provide us information about the building or a particular place, are also considered signs. And this one was rather interesting because it's from 1961, so it's over 50 years old, and it identifies a parking lot mall in Quincy, Illinois. So those places are also becoming to be considered historic. The next category of signs I wanted to talk about are advertisements, and the most popular type of advertisement is a painted ghost sign, as they're called, on side or rear walls of buildings. Sometimes they're even on the front. Now, I define advertisements as a sign that promotes a business or a product, but is not necessarily location specific. So, for example, this Gucci's Best Flower painted ad is on the side of this building, but Gucci's may not have been, in fact, was not in that building. So it's essentially a billboard equivalent of the period. And these painted signs were very popular in the 19th century, but even as various signs and methodologies and construction techniques improve, they continue to be prominent and utilized into the 20th century, because paint is very inexpensive, and as long as you had a wall, you could always paint something on it. Now, a quick preservation sidebar on this: when these signs are in their faded state, they should be preserved as such, and they should be documented, and only when they're beyond recognition and readability should they be repainted. This faded patina of these signs informs us of their age. Otherwise, we lose that very tangible connection with the past. We can, even if when they're repainted, we still get the graphic connection and the information connection, the potential, but we're looking at new paint versus the old. Now, moving on, so these painted ads were the most popular, but other more traditional type billboards were also created, such as this streamlined, modern one from Macomb, Illinois. And then into the 20th century, more billboard type signs were also utilized. And this one is from Owatonna, Minnesota. Very cool mid-20th century sign. A quick note on another type of signage, directional and wayfinding. Directional signs basically point the way and help us orient ourselves in the city. And so examples of that include street names on building corners, crosswalks, as well as various painted arrows and directions on sidewalks and walls of buildings. We don't necessarily have a lot of historic wayfinding signage because that as a sort of a complete system was not conceptualized until in the recent decades, but there are other signs, again, directional, that do exist. I just don't have that many good examples of those because they tend to be supplanted by newer, more contemporary signage. But when they do exist, hopefully they can be saved or at least documented. And then last but not least is, in fact, my favorite type of historic sign, which is the maker's or manufacturer's mark or nameplate. These are often very small and secondary to the product that they are attached to, because their main function was not to advertise the particular company that manufactured the product, but to simply serve as a signature. So the signature was always secondary to the product. It doesn't always exist, but many architectural building components do have them, and they're these very small pieces of graphic design, and it's very fun to try to find them. But aside from the funness, they are really useful in terms of providing another layer of information and potential historic significance. So when we can link a particular product with a company that made it, we can all of a sudden discuss how this product was made, who made it, how did it get to be in this community. So I'm showing you a nameplate here of one of the Mesker companies, which had a nationwide distribution of their products. So we see their products throughout the country, and when these nameplates are present, it allows us to link communities that are thousands of miles apart in certain instances and talk about all these different technological improvements, the Industrial Revolution that linked these various communities together and allowed this kind of manufacture and dissemination of architectural components to happen, all because of a nameplate. So cast iron column bases, whether they're affixed or cast into the columns, sills, thresholds, are all potential for maker's marks. Prism glass transoms are other places where we can find a maker's mark, and most windows have a one tile per window that has the company name. The storefronts systems themselves can have small markers on them, like by the Connier Company or Brasco or others. So these are reserved for basically metal storefront systems. And when we can find them, again, that tells us where this material came from, and opens up a lot of other discussions that we can have about architecture and other things. And these maker's marks can be literally anywhere in the streetscape, not just on buildings. They could be on sidewalks, whether cast into the concrete or as markers, like in this Des Moines, Iowa example. They could be on lampposts, trash receptacles, manhole covers, storm drain covers, and so on and so on. They're literally everywhere, and they're small but mighty in terms of the level of information that they provide. Kind of a sidebar on manufacturers' marks. When we evaluate or document neon signs, particularly ones with a porcelain enamel or a painted steel background, those often have a manufacturer's mark as well. So we have sort of two different layers of signage. So in the Kriege hardware example, we know that the Eberhard company made that sign. And in fact, there is another one below the hardware, but I didn't get a close-up photograph of that. So it actually looks like there were at least two companies that were responsible for manufacturing this particular sign. And we wouldn't know that without these very small markers. And other buildings and signs, I should say, just defy description, and it's just a bit of everything. So if we look at Murray's Restaurant Cocktail Lounge in Minneapolis, Minnesota, each set of signs is critical to our reading of this building, even though the butter knife steak is rather unappetizing, and it's also as big as that Hummer in front of the building. But regardless of how gross it is, it's there, and it was there when the building was built, and it's critical for this facade to continue to read like a billboard, which is what it was intended to do. And then a different type of a billboard, a little bit more understated, is the Alexander's Fine Jewelry facade from Laramie, Wyoming. And in this slipcover, the typography is very small, but the depictions of the the houseware, the jewelry on the facade above are all critical to our to this sign, because that's what this facade is. Again, this would present some difficulties in terms of reuse, but I would argue that this is a rather unusual and great example that may warrant preservation. So what should we do about these historic signs? Well, I think everything starts with survey and documentation. Just like with buildings, we need to figure out what we have documented and then go from there. We know we're not going to be able to save everything, so at least let's have a record of it. So once we know what we have, then we can develop some educational material, and that could take numerous forms: publications, websites about historic signs in a particular community, or again organized by building or a material or design. And certainly there are already numerous collections out there on Flickr, for example, or other websites devoted to neon signs, which are very popular, and those kinds of things. But I think we need something a little bit more comprehensive and scholarly out there, and that's why I think doing it per community would be a good idea. But these education materials could take advantage of all those opportunities: websites, Facebook pages, Flickr groups. You can also develop architectural walking tours. If you have a critical mass of signs, you can incorporate them to existing programming that you have, or develop tours that discuss just those. You can, we already do a sort of architectural treasure hunts where we identify pieces of buildings, and those are very fun for children. We could do that just for signs also. So there are numerous educational opportunities that can and should be undertaken. And then we can supplement that with some legal protection. Sign ordinances and historic preservation ordinances each should have sections on historic signs, and in terms of sign ordinances, distinguish between outdated, obsolete signs and signs that have historic significance. And then historic preservation ordinances should allow landmarking of historic signs, and there are some examples of ordinances that already allow that, but we need more of that. And then we can also have design guidelines, which are more educational, and those can have sections that again document historic signs and talk about what's appropriate, what is inappropriate, why these are important, what can be done to save them and preserve them. So if we're going to do all of this, we should also develop incentives for restoration of historic signs, and that it should be an eligible expenditure for a lot of restoration or rehabilitation projects. So it has to be both a educational and a carrot and stick approach, I think. And then we also need to make sure that we have the means of repair for these signs, which utilize certain technologies and materials that may not be as readily available as they were when those signs were constructed. So neon, for example, is doing great now. It's undergoing a revival, resurgence, if you will. You can repair old neon signs. You can also create new ones. And there are, but for a while though, there was a period of time that wasn't as readily available. So, and that may be the case for other types of materials and building techniques. So, if we're going to, on one hand, demand or not demand, but recommend that historic signs are saved, let's make sure that that's feasible. So, because even if everybody has the best intentions to do so, if no one knows how to do it, then the sign may be doomed simply because we have no means of restoring it or preserving it. And then the last piece, which tends to be pretty critical too, is that signs, because they were intended to grab our attention always, occupy some prime real estate on our Main Street buildings. And so when these businesses are obsolete, how can we, on one hand, preserve the signs, the historic signs, and on the other hand, still allow the new incoming businesses the same kind of visibility that they need to have on the front of these buildings? So this creative retention and reuse component, I'll show you a few examples to hopefully spark some ideas of your own. But that's a critical component, because again, if even with our best intentions, we simply may not be able to save the signs in the original places that they were installed in. So a brief note on survey and documentation. This was a sign in Springfield, Illinois that was uncovered. It was a painted transom. The grid is actually not a prism glass. It's painted on. This was flat glass. But this was uncovered during a storefront rehab. And it just, saving this sign did not go with what needed to happen with this building. So one of the things that could have happened was that the glass could have been taken out and used in a different part of the building inside, and new glass put in here. But a decision needed to be made quickly, and because of budgetary issues and all these different things, simply the sign could not be saved, so the paint was removed. But at least we documented the sign, and we have a record that it existed. But the fine pastries and baby shop simply was not in the program of the business, the entity that needed to go into the storefront. On the flip side, sometimes saving these signs is possible. So this is the Rao Hardware from Crystal Lake, Illinois, and the gold leaf lettering is the historic sign, and then above and below it lettering was added, so now it reads Historic Rao Hardware from 1893 to 1994. So in a very non-invasive way, we were able to retain a historic sign here in the place that it was originally located, and it's sort of a placard, information about the building utilizing the historic sign. So that's something where a location of the sign allows it to do so. It doesn't compete with the existing business, or the new business, I should say, then that's a good solution. Here's another one where a beautiful neon sign was able to be saved even though a new business was coming in. In this case, we were able to recommend that the new sign was installed at the base of these big display windows, and so there is enough distance between the historic sign and the new sign, so the two are not confused. Skeptics may argue that Jane Isbell has greater visibility than Celebrations, and that's true, and it's actually on purpose, because in this case the new business was able to capitalize on 50+ years of built-up recognition and identification value of the Jane Isbell jewelry shop. In this community of Vandalia, Illinois, everybody knows Jane Isbell and where it is, and everybody knows the sign. So in this case, the neon sign is both a business and building identifier. And so Celebrations was able to use that in their marketing, that they're in the Jane Isbell building, and again, people identify with Jane Isbell much quicker than they would with Celebrations. Now, the second layer to the story is that Celebrations is no longer in business. It actually lasted for probably about a year. So in this case, there was a potential of losing a historic sign for the sake of a business that didn't last. So we would have had two tragedies. um, and we would have lost the neon sign. So, and Celebrations didn't go out of business because they didn't have a good sign or a better sign high up above the storefront dedicated to the business. There were other reasons. So so when we consider replacing these kind of landmark signs for new businesses, let's think about what the potential of the new business really is. Not that we should doom it from the get-go, but you know, let's not sacrifice layers of historic fabric for the sake of temporary or transient type businesses. And then if you've seen this example before, I apologize because I do show it a lot, but it's one of my favorites because the intervention to save this historic sign, and in fact this entire storefront, was simply a vinyl dot placed between the R and the U. So what used to read as drugs, and it was a 1940s porcelain enamel pharmacy storefront in Virginia, Illinois, now is Dr. Ugg's Drugstore Cafe. So this one vinyl dot is all that was needed to transform this storefront into a destination type business, because let's be frank, in this case it's very creative, and those are the kind of opportunities that retention and creative reuse of historic signs allows. So yes, we were able to save the sign and the storefront by this vinyl dot, and then other signs obviously in the windows supplement this great historic sign, but we also now have an amazing destination with a great name. So to conclude, this is, if you remember, our 1940s billboard. This is what it still looks like, but what if it looked like this? There is no reason why historic signs can't be repurposed, or parts of them at least repurposed for new uses. And in this case, we proposed a graphic that was period appropriate as a sign to promote the historic district of this community. So this is something that can happen, and historic signs again are very important layers of our built environment that deserve our attention and deserve to be saved. There are numerous resources that are available regarding historic signs, including a National Park Service Preservation Brief 25. There are lots of books about mainly coffee table type books promoting various types of historic signs and documenting them through great photographs. Those are all great, and I'm not going to give you specific examples of those. They're all great. But a relatively new book that I think everyone should have is Characters, Cultural Stories Revealed Through Typography by Stephen Banham. And this book is, yes, it also has great photographs of historic signs, but it actually, in very short stories, goes through signs in Melbourne, Australia, and tells various stories about the city as seen through the historic signs in that city. So don't disregard it just because it's in Australia. Again, it's not about that particular city and those signs, but this book allows and teaches us a way to look at signs and how to read the life of a particular commercial district through the signage. So I would like to see this book is a bit hefty, but something like this on a smaller scale done for in every community. So so I would encourage you to pick up a copy or borrow a copy. I can loan you mine if you can't find the book. So, but it's very well written. Again, these brief cultural stories, as seen, as interpreted through these various signs. So, this is something that we need to do, get beyond just the architecture and graphic design. We still need to do that, and that's certainly why I love it, but we do need to link it with other stories in order to promote the preservation of these signs. So that is it for today's content. I just wanted to quickly promote our upcoming webinars, and then I'll get to your questions. So on July 17th, we have a Don't Faint, It's Just Paint session where we will discuss a quick but reliable philosophy to paint color selection with a focus on commercial buildings, and that's with me. On July 24th, my In Alliance partner Todd Tracy will examine the importance of diversifying youth entrepreneurial development programs so they remain fun and engaging for youth. And then on August 7th, I again will present a session that will explore the benefits in various types of storm window applications, which is a window energy efficiency that does pay and preserves the historic windows. So this information and registration links are all available on our website at www.inalliance.biz/intraining. So with that, thank you very much for your time today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, found it useful, and I will answer your questions now. So let me look through some questions here. And I don't see anything, so without further ado, I will let you go, but feel free to contact me with additional questions if you have any in the future, and again, thank you very much.